be my own media specialist, and
we got you covered.
Oh, I'm grateful. I'm grateful. I have a very important message to give you, and my whole life has been something that has prepared me for this and other things. Now, St. Germaine just didn't come to me once 4 years ago. I've figured out he's been coming to me my whole life. And between him and Jesus, they've given me a lot of instruction. When I was a little kid, 9 months old, I got rheumatic fever. I was just a baby, and I was being watched by somebody else, and my mom was working hard, and by the time she got home at night, she just didn't have the wherewithal to check me out and make sure I was fine. 9-month-old baby. I hadn't started walking yet. Got a severe fever. Didn't get taken to the doctor for a couple of days. When they checked me out, I had rheumatic fever. Now, as you know, rheumatic fever is a severe strep infection. And it goes septic, it goes throughout your body. Well, my heart got affected. And by the time they gave me some penicillin, I had valvular disease in my mitral and tricuspid valve. I had what you call regurgitation. And by the time I was 5 years old, the doc said, boy, he's going to need valve replacement. And so they sent me to a cardiologist, and here I am, just a 5-year-old. And I'm sitting there going, wow, this is really cool, he's got my heart pumping up on the monitor, and he's saying it's irregular, and he's telling my mom I need pig valves put in my heart. Pig? Boy, that sounds cool. I would love to have pig valves. I had no idea as a 5-year-old what was even happening. Luckily, we were so poor we couldn't afford to go back and continue the treatment. I never did have pig valves put into me. They told my mom that by the time he's 10 years old, his heart will be big enough, he'll definitely need some new valves. And so when I was 10 years old, we were still so poor, she decided not to take me in because, back then she didn't have any insurance. She was working a job that barely paid the rent. And I remember we didn't eat good food at all. It was, half the time I'd flip it up on the ceiling and let it pop up there, And so I was a real skinny little kid. And with these valve problems, they told me I couldn't even go out and participate in PE because they were afraid I'd drop dead on the floor. And so I told them all to go to heck, and I started playing basketball anyway. So I'd run up and down the court just like the other kids. I'd feel really crappy. I'd always have chest pain, but I did it anyway because I just didn't want to let life pass me by. So by the time I was 13, I had gotten in a bad crowd. I figured I was going to die anyway, so we started drinking and smoking in the 7th and 8th grade. I was running with a really bad crowd. And, we ended up going up to the mountain. There's a mountain above Cedar City. I grew up in southern Utah, called Brian Head. It's about 13,000 feet. And there's a ski resort up there. And we went up, we skipped out of school, went up to the ski resort, and I started skiing down the mountain, and there was a couple of bottles of whiskey somebody had put in the snow. And those were just for me, I thought, and so I went over and I sat down in the snow and I started drinking that alcohol. I woke up 3 days later in my bed with the worst cotton mouth I've ever had in my life. I mean, literally, I couldn't even hardly talk. And I was told, there was a note on my pillow that said, for my mother, that said, I hope you've learned a very valuable lesson. And they didn't know if I was going to come out of this alcoholic coma or not, because my alcohol levels were so high. The doc said, he had probably destroyed his brain and his liver. And so, anyway, I remember coming back And I wasn't the same kid I was before. I didn't want to smoke. I didn't want to drink. My other friends were starting to do marijuana. I didn't want to do that. In fact, I didn't even want to be around these kids because they vibrated so low, you know. They were not only doing things with alcohol, drugs, and tobacco, they were starting to mess around with the girls. And boy, I just thought that was taboo, you know, when I came out of this. And luckily, I hadn't done anything because I was kind of shy. But my whole life changed at that moment. I was 13 years old, and literally I knew I was supposed to do well in school, learn as much as I could, and I knew I was supposed to go become a doctor. It was the weirdest thing. And so for the next 5 years, I studied so hard, I actually was next to the valedictorian. The gal who got valedictorian took a lot easier courses than me. I wasn't the greatest at English, and so I got an A- in English in 9th grade. All the rest of my grades were A's. And school was just easy for me because I had what you call a photographic memory. I could just look at something one time, and I could go through the files in my brain and have it come up, and I could see it and read it from the the picture in my mind. And so I had a really easy time in school, but I did study a lot too. And by the time I was 18, I knew I was supposed to go to college, and I had a full ride scholarship to go to Southern Utah State University. Well, actually back then it was just a college. They called it SUSC, Southern Utah State College. And my girlfriend was up at BYU, which is a Mormon university up in Provo, Utah, and she wanted me to go with her up to BYU because I actually got a full ride scholarship up at BYU because my grades were so good. And I decided to stay in Cedar City because I didn't want her to molest me or do anything because she wanted to get married. And I knew I wasn't supposed to get married yet. So I let her stay up there, and I actually went to school for only 3 years in college because I clept my entire first year of college. They called it a clep test back then. And but at 19, I went on a mission for the LDS Church, the Mormon Church, and I was called to serve in South Florida, and told I needed to learn Spanish, and so I started learning Spanish in the MTC up in Provo, Utah, and then they sent us off to Miami. Well, we got to Miami, and then they put us on another plane, a 747, and unbeknownst to me, I ended up in Puerto Rico. And it was quite interesting. They hadn't told us where we were going to end up or anything, but I ended up in a place called Bayamon, Puerto Rico. How many of you have been to Bayamon? Beautiful town, beautiful town. When I went to Puerto Rico, there was about 1.6 million people. And most of the Puerto Ricans lived in New York. And so when I went to Puerto Rico, a lot of them were coming back. They had this call to come back to the island. And so by the time I left, a year and a half later, there was 3.2 million. So half the population in New York, there was about 5 million Puerto Ricans in New York and about 1.6 on the island. About half of them, half the population came back to Puerto Rico because they decided to come back, and it was quite interesting. The island had this magical stuff going on. Well, about midway through my mission, I was, the missionaries always ride their bikes, and we were riding our bikes down the road, and this car went out of its way, going about 60 miles an hour, and boom, ran right into me. And I got thrown into a telephone pole, and my companion later told me God, I could hear your back cracking as it wrapped around the telephone pole. And I woke up in a hospital in Monterey, which is a suburb of San Juan. And I woke up, had a sheet over my head, and I was like, what the heck's going on? So I threw the sheet off, and all the nurses were like, "Estaba muerta, estaba muerta!" You know, and they just started screaming, "Doctor, renegade!" And but anyway, apparently I had died, and they were taking me down to the morgue. And the doc came in, and he says, "How are you sitting up? You had a broken back." And he showed me my X-rays.
Wow, that's fine.
And I also had a broken femur in the X-rays. And I was standing up looking at my X-rays. And he says, "Can I redo these X-rays?" I said, "Sure." And so he redid the X-rays, and he just stood there looking at them for about half an hour.
No way.
And there was nothing broken after I woke up. And he was just amazed. And the next day I went off and started riding my bike again. I mean, it was, you know, one of those things. But the interesting thing, the reason I'm telling this story, when I was 13 and I came back, I had what you call clairaudience. My brother had schizophrenia, and I was really freaked out at 13 because he was listening to the dark side, and I could hear the voices, the dark voices talking to him, and I was like, boy, these guys are bad. And so I made a decision at 13 not to listen to the dark side. I just filtered them out. I could only hear the good side. So I was born with clairvoyance. I could see auras. At 13, I was given clairsentience. And then at 20, I came back with claircognizance. It was really weird. I could hear and know what was going on with people. I mean, I'd look at people and I'd know what was wrong with their body, and I'd hear the voice of Jesus say, this and this and this is going on with them. And I correlated it with Jesus because that was my only heavenly being that I believed in at the time. So anyway, moving on, after I completed college, I got accepted into 10 different medical schools because my grades were so good, my MCAT was so good, everybody wanted me. And as I traveled around going to the different medical schools, St. Louis University sort of rang something within me and said, you're supposed to go here. And you know, when I went to the town, I don't know if you know much about St. Louis in the 80s, it was a tough place. I mean, it was not the kindest area in the country. It was more like Washington, D.C. and St. Louis were two of the worst cities, had the highest crime rates and murder rates in the nation. And so I ended up going to St. Louis U. And my first 2 years of medical school were quite interesting. I you know, just looked at the pages because I didn't have time. I was married, had 2 kids, and didn't have a lot of money. And so I had to do what you call moonlighting. And at least the officials of the school said, don't you dare moonlight. But I had to. So I learned about this job with this company called Coburn, Crofts and Putzel. And they had this huge skyscraper downtown by the Arch. And so I loved going there. And my job was to interview people who had been the linemen of the telephone companies and the electrical companies to see if Agent Orange and dioxin were causing the problems with their bodies. And I came to find that correlated. All their diseases correlated. They had chronic arthritis, cancers, they were getting all kinds of things like we're seeing in most people today. And they had been exposed to high levels, and their bodies had levels of these chemicals you could find, you know, on blood testing. And so my job was to test their blood and do all that stuff and correlate it. And they were paying me $50 an hour. I could bill $50 an hour to this law firm, and they paid me. And I was like, wow, you know, back in the 80s, that was a lot of money. I mean, the job I'd been doing before as a waiter, I got $5 an hour, and I was really happy with that, you know. And so anyway, at the very end of your second year of medical school, you do something called physical diagnosis. It's a class where you actually go look at people, and you know, you can tell by their bodies what's going on. And it was really fascinating because the very first gal I did an interview with and examined her body was this 16-year-old black gal from the inner city, and started talking to her, and you know, I looked at her skin and stuff, and she had these things on her arm, going up her arm, and I was like, what is that going on with your arm? And she said to me, boy, ain't you seen twice? That's where I put my hair on. And I was like, what? You know, because I was a country bumpkin. I had no idea that this stuff was going on. And I came to find out that a lot of the inner city girls, they would hook them on heroin and use them as prostitutes because they could subdue their better natures by getting them hooked on the drug. And literally, they would crave the drugs, and they would say, look, you've got to do this or you don't get any more, you know, and they hooked them on these drugs. And it was a big problem. And that's one of the reasons there was such a high amount of crime, was the drug problem was huge. So anyway, I then, my first rotation as a third-year medical student was OBGYN. And let me tell you, I just loved OBGYN because my first rotation was in the obstetrical ward. I showed up, I had read about doing a delivery the night before, I had read about doing an episiotomy. Luckily, my grandma had taught me how to sew up socks and such, so I knew how to sew. And I was taken told to go to this room and assist this intern who was doing a delivery. And there was a 14-year-old girl who was pregnant, ready to deliver. Her mom was in there, and the intern was in there. St. Louis City Hospital was quite interesting. The med students did all the grunt work. I don't know if you understand what that is, but we had to run the lab materials down the lab. We had to draw blood. We had to do, I mean, we were basically doing the job of nurses because St. Louis City Hospital couldn't afford nurses. And so they even had nursing students doing the nursing. And so we didn't really have professionals there. And interns were the doctors. And the second years were their leaders. And the third years were their leaders and so forth, you know. But we were all just residents and interns and medical students. You know, it was worse than Scrubs. How many have seen the show Scrubs? I used to love Scrubs. But so anyway, I'm in there and I'm just supposed to watch. They taught us watch one, do one, teach one. I mean, that's how busy everybody was. So this intern was brand new. It was July, and he had just barely completed medical school, so he was pretty new. And AIDS had just come out, and so everybody was freaking out about bodily fluids. We didn't even know how it was transmitted. I mean, it was, you know, we thought, oh, we've got to figure this out. Anyway, this little gal is just let out a blood-curdling scream. She grabbed a hold of the intern's arms, dug her nails in, and pulled really hard. She tore through his gown, went into the flesh, and his flesh was bleeding. And then she popped her bag of waters, and the fluid went all over it. And the intern just was freaking out, and he threw his hands in the air, and he says, "You take over." I haven't done anything medical in my life. Well, I operated on my rabbits when I was younger, and stuff like that. But anyway, so I sat down in the chair, and she lets out another blood-curdling scream. The head is coming out, and all of a sudden the heavens open up, because I've got clairvoyance, it kind of distracted